Hey guys, it's Goosebumps Completionist, and today I'm bringing you another review from the Haunting Hour television series. And this episode comes from season 3. It was written by Greg Yolen and Natalie Lapointe, and it was directed by Ken Friss. And the episode in question is Terrible Love. Now, since Terrible Love was never released on home media, I'll be overlaying an image here for reference. So, Terrible Love, this episode and I really don't have much memories of it. This was around the time of the Haunting Hour. Well, it was in season 3, so I definitely did have it on my DVR at one point. But this was around the time, I can remember when I first watched this, I was kind of getting out of the show. Because after I watched through season 1 and season 2, I started to notice the quality start to drop just a little bit by season 3. And by season 4, I just became uninterested. And this episode kind of shows the weaknesses of those final 2 seasons in a lot of ways. It's not the greatest thing ever. I think it's mostly fine. It does have its redeeming qualities. But the reason why I decided to watch this one was for the Valentine's Day holiday, to get myself kind of in the spirit for Valentine's horror. And if you had to know one thing how I feel before we go any further, and I'll save the rest for the review portion later, but honestly, I just feel like I took away a bunch of tropes that are definitely overused in romantic comedies and romantic media, and there's nothing that you haven't seen before here. This is definitely one of those episodes, like a handful in the show, that's kind of saved by one actor being in it. And that's one thing I want to get off my chest before we go any further into the plot overview and the review about the Haunting Hour show. While it's widely remembered as being one of the best, if not the best, kids horror show, I'll be damned to say this, but there's a lot of filler in this show. There's a lot of forgettable mid stuff. Just the highs are higher than those old shows, I feel. So with that being said, I guess my hot take, and I probably pissed a lot of you off for saying that, but that's just how I feel. Let's get into the Haunting Hours episode here. This is one of the episodes, like majority of the show, that was written for the series, and this is definitely not a story that was included in the Nightmare Hour or the Haunting Hour short story collections, because it's not written by R.L. Stine. So just know that before you get into it. But the story starts off with this girl named Maggie, and I think she's played by this girl named Emma Grabinski, who starred in a few other episodes. I know that she was in one of my personal favorites from the show, Creature Feature, and I cannot wait to talk about that at one point. So seeing her here was a good treat. And she's in a science room, and she's, I guess, in a chemistry lab. They have beakers everywhere in the room. And she's looking over at this guy named Brendan, who she has a massive crush on. And there's some consternation that you learn later on about this guy named Brendan, is that he's going to be in the leading role of Romeo in Romeo and Juliet. And, while she's smitten with this guy, kind of like daydreaming, nodding off, she accidentally drops some chemicals she wasn't supposed to in the beaker, and it billows up the whole room in smoke. And ironically, she passes out, and she's visited by a being or an entity. And this entity is played by, I think his name is Peter DeLuise, and you might recognize him from The Wizards of Waverly Place. He played the father on that show. And he definitely saves this episode in a lot of ways. And he reveals himself to be Cupid, and he's like, look, I can help you out. I can help you out with Brendan. All you have to do is just, take my advice or just let me help you. And she's like talking in her, I guess, unconsciousness with him. But then she comes to, and the teacher is like, oh, you've been talking to yourself. And she's like embarrassed because everybody in the room, including her crush, has heard what she said. But most importantly, there's this other kid named Stuart, who is like, I guess, friend zoned by this girl. And this kind of leans into that typical romantic comedy trope that we always see when the girls are the main character, is that she'll friend zone a guy off to the side, ignore him. She's into some dumb jock type guy that's kind of dreamy but really dumb. It's no different here. It's no different here. So just know that going forward. But Stuart is like keeping a watchful eye on her because he thinks something might be up. But as the story goes along, Maggie, she gets visited by Peter DeLuise playing Cupid. And he's like, look, I can shoot him. I can give you a love potion. I got a new vial here to test out. I shoot it with my arrow, and he gets smitten with you. And she's like, you know what? Why not? It couldn't hurt. So Cupid shoots this new love vial into Brendan, and Brendan starts to have these emotional feelings towards Maggie. And Maggie's like, oh, wow, this is great and awesome. And then, she's ignoring her friend Stuart and in the process. But there comes a point where he is going to go rehearse Romeo and Juliet with this other girl. And there's like this thing mentioned, I think very vaguely, that the potion can wear off if, they lock lips with another girl that they might like or something, or the truth will come out or something like that. Something very vague like that. It's briefly mentioned, and I don't even remember the whole deal with that. But she gets worried that Brendan might fall out of love with her under this potion, so she asks Cupid to shoot him again with another vial. And in doing so, this turns Brendan into like this crazed, obsessed type of guy, where now he's like all up her butt. And there's a really, I guess, tense scene where he brings a box and he tries to give it to Maggie, and she opens it up, and there's a freaking tarantula in the box. And he's like, I'm just bitten with love from you, and, I hope it bites you or something. And he's starting to act kind of crazy, which weirds out Maggie. And Maggie's talking with Cupid, and Cupid's like, well, I tried to warn you what would happen. And now she has to deal with this psycho-obsessed guy that she injected with this love serum. So, without going into too much other spoiler territory, because this is very easy to spoil. It's a very cut and dry story. Maggie has this climactic altercation with crazed Brendan. And Brendan is kind of creepy and like following her around in a disturbing way. And let's just say Cupid finds a way to kind of help the situation and put a stop to this Brendan thing. And what results of that is Maggie looks to her friend Stuart, who may or may not also help save the day. And there's this thing with Stuart where she's like, thank you for saving me. And you think there might be a glimpse of hope that them two will end up together. But because this is an R.L. Stine franchise, there's a plot twist involved dealing with Cupid and Stuart. And let's just leave it at that. And that's where the story ends, essentially. And that's what you're going to expect out of Terrible Love. So, all in all, Terrible Love is more of a cautionary tale in the heart of it. And I guess I'll get into my positives with it off the bat. One thing I really enjoyed about this episode were the performances in it. I think the girl, I think her name is Emma Grabinski, and Peter DeLuise playing Maggie and Cupid, did a fantastic job for the material they were given. Their performances were some of the better ones I've seen from this show, so I'll give them that. The guy who played Brendan, kind of typical for this. He's an airhead guy because it's a girl-centered story. It's a typical trope that, the only thing he's good for is looking good type of thing. So, not much to him, but when he turns on that creepiness, when he gets injected the second time, the actor really sold how creepy Brendan's obsession with Maggie was. So I really enjoyed that part of the episode, surprisingly. Another thing I really liked is the cautionary element. This, in a lot of ways, is playing on that similar idea that former Goosebumps stories like Be Careful What You Wish For is coming to do, right? It falls into that you have a larger-than-life, mystical, magical being granting the wish or the desires of the protagonist. But anytime they touch something to help, they end up making it worse. Or they end up ruining it somehow and sabotaging it. And Cupid in this story falls down that. But that also brings it some charm. And I think the cautionary element about the girl wanting the hot guy without understanding the repercussions of what she's doing is a good message to send. Even though it didn't fully commit to that idea, I think it spent a lot of time kind of padding itself out. And we'll get into that in the negatives very shortly. But at least that message is there and it's quite concise. And the last positive I can give it is actually the twist ending. For a change, Haunting Hour's twists sometimes can make or break the episode. If it's a lame twist, whatever, sometimes they're done in like a goofy way to kind of make it more lighthearted. Sometimes they'll try to push a serious twist on a goofy story that just clashes. And then sometimes they'll do a dark twist in a more serious story that just sends it home. This one isn't any of those. It's just kind of goofy, but in like a charming way. And I think it sends off the episode for what it is in a good regard. So yeah, it's pretty decent amount of positives with this story here. However, let's get into the negatives. And the biggest, most pronounced one I can say about this episode is that it is pretty much trope the episode. Using romantic comedy cliches that you've seen before, just done here for a child audience. And I'm going to be honest, there's plenty of kids media already doing this type of cliche storytelling. And it being put into Haunting Hour of all places, I don't know if it really fits. And I don't mean any disrespect to Natalie or Greg Yolen, or I think Natalie Lapointe, that's her name. I don't mean any disrespect to the writers of this. But, you know, you could have at least put a little more creativity or a fresh spin on the idea. None of this stuff was new. And I'm sorry to say this, but Peter DeLuise, his Cupid character, he's a scene chewer in every scene he's in, but the material he's given is also not that great. And this seems to be in a lot of these episodes that try to hire out some bigger actors, like the special case would be like a Tom Kenny, for example, or the guy who played Nosferatu that they got to play in like Fear Never Knocks. You know, these episodes don't really have much going for them, but the big names they get, or semi-big names, it's hard to say Peter DeLuise is a big name, but he's definitely recognizable in at least the kids' media of the time. So having him here kind of helps elevate the material, but if you remove him out of the equation, this story is just very bland and basic. I mean, like I said, there's nothing that you haven't seen here before. It's overplaying the trope of the girl wants the hot guy who's really dumb. She friend zones the guy that's actually into her and probably better suited for her and her type. But she gets wrapped up in a scheme, goes through some weird shenanigans, and ends up in the arms of the guy she friend zoned. Been there, done that. Do something different, please. Yeah, that's the biggest, most pronounced thing that just really irked me. It's not a horror story. Sorry. The second negative is, you know, I think the character of Brendan, he does get good, but for like the first half of the episode, this guy Brendan, you know nothing about this guy. You don't know why she's into this guy at all. And the material he's given does not sell me that he is worth all of this trouble to go through. And it makes the story kind of feel forced. And tying with that, for as basic as this story is, you would expect padding here. And it does have its fair share of padding, but the padding in this episode just feels on the, you know, borderline redundant nature of it. Because this guy gets shot twice by Cupid's potion. And it makes the first time he got shot and all the events leading up to the second time he got shot feel like a waste of time. You could have had him acting psychopathic almost immediately and just went straight into that and leaned more into the horror side of things and made it more kind of suspenseful and eerie. And maybe in like a Fear Street type of way, but keep it more pseudo young adult and not all the way like the Fear Street books go. But no, they waste your time with this. Oh, we got to shoot him up twice because we need more scenes with Peter DeLuise because we're paying this amount of money to have him on this episode. And I think I read the wiki The only reason why Peter DeLuise, I think, took a role on this show was because his brother, I think his name is David or something, he was a director on the show. So there you go. I don't know what to say. It's just very padded too. And one last negative to throw out there. I feel like the whole setup to the story, right? While it is kind of like a fantasy, it's kind of like a fantasy story at the heart of it, so I can let a little bit slide. But the logic of how she interacts with Cupid compared to the ending twist leaves a lot of questions, because if this thing was the motif of her getting to meet Cupid, then how did this other person get to meet Cupid, right? It's just, it kind of, you know, even though I really love the twist, it just makes it more convoluted and confusing than it really needs to be, honestly. It's kind of frustrating, and it's not the biggest negative I have, but it is there. Yeah, I really don't have much else to say about this one. This might be a shorter review. But honestly, when it comes to this story, it's just very basic. There's not a lot to it. And some people might like basic sometimes. And granted, I do like me a basic story here and there, especially if the idea is good enough and you can execute it good enough and you're able to keep a certain tone of suspense or scares throughout the mix, or maybe even make it fun. I'm cool with that. But this episode just isn't fun. It isn't creative. It isn't something you haven't seen before. It's pretty much a paint-by-number story, just throwing it in with Peter DeLuise stealing the show. And without him, honestly, y'all, this would be a very low meh. So from like a 0 to 5 star basis, this has some things reminiscent to some other episodes I've covered in the past, but the main one it reminds me of from this show is Lots of Luck. And I've said in my Lots of Luck review, I know some people gave me some backlash for that, but that story is also very bland and basic when it comes to this type of story. And the only reasons why it kind of excelled and made its way into the C tier were some of those flashback elements, and mainly Brendan Fletcher playing the leprechaun Seamus. If you remove those factors, that episode would have been like a D tier, easily. Without Peter DeLuise, this would be like maybe like a 3.1 out of 5 stars. Just for how offensively basic and bland it is. But because he's entertaining, I bumped it up to like 3.4 out of 5. And those issues I had, I kind of weighed heavier for this because, you know, I could be a little more fair and say that they're more structurally sound and doesn't bite off more than it can chew. It could be like an average story. An average to me would be like a 3.5, 3.6. But I think this is more okay and fine, all said and done. So a 3.4 is fair for that, which is a D plus in my book. A D plus is still a passing grade, but it's not something I would go out of my way to recommend to the masses, especially in like a horror show. I want to recommend this to y'all. It's not that well conceived. It's not that well executed. It's just kind of just a fast-paced, you know, time killer type of episode. In a lot of ways, I hate to use this term, but it is kind of a filler episode of the Haunting Hour series as a whole. And that's just my opinion, but I think a lot of you would agree with me out there that have seen this. It's not the most special thing in the world, but it's not terrible either. It's not quite good, in my opinion, but it's also not bad at all. So, that's my thoughts on Terrible Love. Let me know down in the comment section if you've seen this episode before. Do you love it or do you hate this? I'm dying to know, and I'll see you next time.